So there's this young woman in the Bible, and her name is Esther. And despite Esther's name, Esther's hot. She is one attractive young lady. Now, before you start pointing the finger at me and saying, Adam, you're objectifying Esther, I would just like to point this out. You're right. I am. But the Bible did it first. Read the Book of Esther, and you get the idea that even when it says Esther's beautiful, it really means that she's hot. I mean, the king is having issues with his wife, so he kicks her out, and he brings in all of these other women to test them, and they come into his room, and he's like, no, 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 and then Esther comes in to his room, and Esther's this hero of the Bible, and so I don't really know what she's doing in the king's room, but she's in there for a long time, and when she leaves the room, the king says, I want that one. She's good. But I don't know what they're doing. I mean, she's a hero of the Bible, so she's got to have these strong family values. So I'm sure they were just hanging out and talking about stuff. Anyway, so let's take a look back and see how this all unfolds. Esther starts off with this king named Xerxes. And he has a wife who's also very hot, and her name is Vashti. That's a hot name, Vashti. Anyway, the king wants to show off Vashti's beautiful to everyone so that he can say, hey, I'm the man, look at my hot wife. But Vashti's like, no, I don't want to do that. Now, it doesn't say why Vashti doesn't want to do that, but you kind of get the sense that the king has done this before. He's objectified Vashti a few times in the past, and maybe Vashti's like, I've had enough, I'm not doing that anymore. But there's a problem, because when you say no to the king, there are generally two outcomes. One, you get beheaded. Two, you get excluded, scapegoated, divorced, what have you. I would never do this to my wife. I love her. Just FYI. But you see what happens here is that the king and Vashti get into this mimetic rivalry. Yes, I said it. Mimetic rivalry. Mimetic comes from the Greek word mimesis, which generally gets translated as imitation, but it's not so much imitation. You see, it's a non-conscious imitation. You don't know that you're doing it. And it's not just imitation where they look exactly the same and imitate everything that they're doing. There can be this reverse imitation. And if you don't believe me on this reverse imitation thing, go to any house where there are parents and teenagers and you'll see instantly what I'm talking about. It works both ways. So that when one person does thing, the other person wants to distinguish him or herself from that person, so it does the exact opposite. So it's this reverse imitation. I know it's very confusing. If you go to the Raven Foundation website, you can learn all about it. But here's what happens. So King Xerxes is like, hey, come out and show off your beauty so that everybody can know that I'm the man. And she's like, hey, no, I don't want to go out and show everyone that you're the man because I want to be, I don't know, my own woman or whatever. It doesn't say, but that's the idea that you get. So there's this reverse imitation. King Xerxes wants power over his wife. His wife wants to assert her own power. And so they have this same desire, this same imitation for power or control. And it ends up being shown in this reverse imitation. Fascinating stuff. You really should go to the Raven Foundation website and learn more about it. So what ends up happening is that the king goes to his council and they say, yeah, why don't you just exclude her, give her a divorce, and then move on. So that's what the king ends up doing. Well, he ends up finding Esther, as we talked about before, and Esther's a young Jewish woman. The good Jewish woman who does this thing in the bedroom and the king likes it, so they end up getting married. Well, what ends up happening is that one of the king's soldiers is named Hammond. So Hammond gets in this very serious conflict with Esther's uncle, whose name is Mordecai. Mordecai. That's not an attractive name. So Hammond and Mordecai get into this rivalry. Hammond is the greatest general for the king, and he wants everybody to bow down to him. Well, Mordecai is a good Jew, and he's not going to bow down to anyone except for God. And so the more that Mordecai doesn't want to bow down to Hammond, the more Hammond wants Mordecai to bow down to him. And there's this escalating rivalry. Again, you see this reverse imitation thing happening. And it just gets out of control, so it ends up consuming Hammond, and he ends up wanting to kill Mordecai. Not just Mordecai, but all of the Jews, because none of the Jews are going to bow down to him, because they're all worshiping God. So Hammond wants to kill and annihilate and destroy all of the Jews. That is the phrase that gets used: kill, annihilate, and destroy. Well, what ends up happening in the story is that Mordecai ends up getting the king's favor, and Esther gets the king's favor too, and so the Jews are saved. But what ends up happening is that now Mordecai and the Jews are able to, same exact phrase, kill, annihilate, and destroy their enemies. And so this is what they do to Hammond and his sons, and to all of the other enemies of the Jews. Now, this is mimesis, imitation, that looks a lot alike. And this is what happens when you threaten one another with violence. You end up imitating one another's violence for acts of revenge. And I gotta be honest, all of this explicit violence and revenge at the end of Esther makes me uncomfortable. Now, it may be making me uncomfortable because it's forcing me to come to terms with my own desires for revenge against my enemies. That may be a part of it, but it's never challenged, and that bothers me when violence doesn't get challenged in the Bible. And it bothers me in part because I like to read the Bible, and I try to interpret life in general through the life of the Jewish Jesus. And this doesn't look a lot like what Jesus was up to, but I think that there is implicitly a challenge to all of this violence in the Bible, in Esther. At least there's a question, because you see, never once is God mentioned in Esther. King Xerxes is mentioned 190 times, but the king of the Jews, the one who they are to bow down to, is never mentioned once. And what is that about? Well, I think the question that the authors are grappling with is, where is God in all of this? We're not going to point it out to you. You're going to have to figure that out. Is God in this act of freedom where Mordecai and the Jews experience this freedom? Or is God involved in this revenge and this violence that they inflict upon their enemies? Is God in both places? Is God nowhere in either of those places? Where is God in all of this? That's the question that Esther is asking us. And I think that's the question we need to ask while we are reading Esther. So those are my thoughts. I'd love to hear yours. Thanks.